The grand ballroom of Seoul's most talked-about hotel had gone quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet around real money. Waitstaff moved like they were choreographed. At the center table sat a woman in a black tailored coat dress, a single cuff of hand-embroidered silk peeking from her sleeve, the only ornament she wore, and somehow the loudest thing in the room. Across the floor, 3 boys in identical mini tuxedos stood at attention beside their father's security detail, waiting to be presented to the guests the way they'd been trained to. Then the middle one stopped moving. His eyes weren't on the woman's face. They were on her cuff, on the pattern stitched into it, a spiral of thread that curled like a fingerprint no machine could replicate. His hand went to his own jacket, to the inside seam where an identical pattern was hidden, sewn in by a mother he'd never met. His brothers turned to look at him first. Then, one by one, they saw it too. The tears came before he could stop them. He didn't run to his father. He didn't run to his brothers. He took one step toward the woman at the center table and asked, so quietly that only she heard it, "Did you make this?" She looked down at the small hand pointing at her sleeve, and the coffee cup in her grip went still. 7 years. Paris. A silk pattern she'd only ever shown to 3 people, and buried one of them in a memory she never let herself finish. "Where?" she said, her voice barely holding. "Did you get that?" Cynthia Okoro had built an empire on discipline. She didn't do surprises, didn't do sentiment on the clock, and never, not once in 8 years, let anyone see the part of her that still woke up some nights, reaching for 3 babies who weren't there. Seoul was supposed to be a business trip, the biggest collaboration of her career, a partnership with a conglomerate powerful enough to put her name in every fashion capital on earth. She had rehearsed every version of this week, except this one, because the silk in that boy's jacket wasn't inspired by her work. It was her work, a pattern she'd hand-stitched into 3 baby blankets the night before they were taken from her, back when she was 23, broke, and too trusting of the wrong people in a foreign city. She'd told herself for years that the trail had gone cold. She had never told herself it might walk up to her in a hotel ballroom wearing a bow tie. Across the room, a man was already moving toward them, tall, unreadable, flanked by men who didn't look like ordinary security. Lee Young-jun. The name alone came with warnings attached. And judging by the look on his face, as he saw his son crying in front of a stranger, whatever answer Cynthia was about to get, he intended to control exactly how much of it she heard. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I'd love to say hello and see just how far this story travels with us. Lee Young-jun crossed the ballroom floor the way men like him always did, without hurrying and without needing to. The crowd parted before he arrived, the way water moves aside for something heavier than itself. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply crouched beside his son, one hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder, and said something low in Korean that made the other 2 brothers step in closer, protective and confused all at once. "Ji-ho." His voice carried the practiced calm of a man used to diffusing situations before they became stories. "Let's not trouble the lady." But Cynthia was already on her feet. She hadn't meant to stand. 20 years of composure, the kind she'd built brick by brick since she was a girl, with more talent than money, since Paris, since everything, should have kept her seated, gracious, unreadable. Instead, her whole body had gone taut. Every instinct she'd spent a decade suppressing, rising to the surface at once. "Wait!" The word left her before she could stop it. Young-jun looked up, and for a moment, something passed over his face that she couldn't name. Not anger, not quite alarm. Something closer to recognition of a danger he hadn't accounted for. "My apologies," he said smoothly, straightening, gathering his sons the way a man gathers something precious and slightly breakable. "My son gets emotional at these events. Long night for them. That pattern. Cynthia's eyes hadn't left the boy's lapel, where the fold of his jacket had come loose, just enough to show the lining beneath. A flash of pale silk, hand-stitched, spiraled thread catching the chandelier light. "Where did you get that fabric?" "It came with the suit," Young Jun said, too quickly, too smooth. The answer of a man who'd rehearsed deflections his whole life. "A tailor in Rome, I believe. No tailor in Rome makes that stitch." Her voice had dropped, quiet and precise, the way it did in meetings when she was 3 seconds from ending a negotiation. "I do. I have for 8 years. There isn't a machine on earth that replicates it, because I've never let it near one." The boy, Ji-ho, his father had called him, looked up at her with the unguarded wonder only children still carry, wiping his face with the back of his small hand. "You made it?" he asked, and something in the simplicity of the question landed harder than anything else that night. Young Jun's jaw tightened. "We should go," he told his sons, gently, but with a finality that closed the conversation like a door. "Mr. Lee." Cynthia said his name, the way she said things she intended to be remembered. "We have a fashion partnership to finalize this week. I think we should discuss this properly, privately." He studied her for a long moment, longer than politeness required, long enough that she understood he was recalculating something, reassessing her the way he might reassess an opponent who'd just revealed she held better cards than he'd assumed. "Of course," he said finally. "My office. Tomorrow." And then he was gone, 3 small tuxedoed shapes, disappearing through the crowd with him, one of them glancing back at her once before the doors closed. Cynthia didn't remember sitting back down. She didn't remember Kemi appearing at her elbow, didn't remember the ride up the elevator to her suite, the card key, the door. What she remembered, what she would remember for the rest of her life, was standing in the marble quiet of her penthouse bathroom afterward, gripping the edge of the sink, staring at a woman in the mirror who looked exactly like the version of herself the world had come to know, composed, formidable, untouchable, and underneath it, unraveling in real time, was the 23-year-old girl she used to be. Paris came back to her the way it always did, not gently, never gently, but in one merciless wave. She had been an intern then, brilliant and broke, and utterly alone, in a city that ate girls like her for breakfast. She'd taken the money because she'd had no choice, a surrogacy arrangement, they'd called it, brokered by a woman with kind eyes and a predator's patience, promising Cynthia enough to survive another year of unpaid apprenticeships if she simply carried a child for a wealthy couple who couldn't. She'd been so naive, she hadn't questioned why the contracts kept changing, why the clinic felt more like a warehouse, why the woman's kindness always arrived with paperwork attached. She hadn't known there would be 3. She hadn't known, until the very end, that there was no couple at all, only a network, a syndicate, operating in the space between desperate women and desperate money, moving children like inventory across borders where no one asked questions. She remembered the sterile white room. She remembered counting 3 heartbeats on a monitor and feeling something in her crack open that she hadn't known existed. She remembered stitching the silk into 3 small blankets by hand in the nights before the birth, a pattern of her own design, something private and unrepeatable, because some fierce, wordless part of her had needed to leave a mark on them that no contract could erase. And she remembered waking up after the birth to empty arms, and a nurse who wouldn't meet her eyes, and a woman with kind eyes and predator's patience who was already gone. She had searched for 6 years before she let herself stop searching in the way that broke you, and started searching instead in the way that built something, a brand, an empire, a name so loud it could not be ignored anywhere on earth, in the quiet hope that if she made herself impossible to miss, one day, something lost might find its way back to her. She hadn't expected it to be 3 boys in mini tuxedos in a Seoul ballroom, but grief, she'd learned, rarely announced itself on schedule. She didn't sleep that night. She sat by the window with the city glittering beneath her like scattered rhinestones, and turned the same question over and over, sharp enough to cut. Coincidence or confirmation? By morning, she had her answer decided. If not proven, she would walk into Lee Young-jun's boardroom, sign whatever contract required signing, and find out everything else with the same precision she used to build a fashion house from nothing. The Lee Group headquarters occupied 40 floors of glass and steel in Gangnam, the kind of building designed to remind visitors of their own smallness before they reached the elevator. Cynthia arrived in a structured ivory suit. Kemi, a half step behind her, with a tablet of terms neither of them intended to discuss first. Young-jun met her at the door of the boardroom himself, which she understood immediately as a message. Not deference, but control. A man who wanted to know exactly what happened in every room he occupied. "Miss Okoro." His handshake was firm, brief, professional. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Lee." She matched his tone precisely. "Let's talk business." They did, for the better part of an hour, terms and margins and licensing structures moving between them, with the fluency of two people equally fluent in power. But Cynthia had spent a career reading rooms, reading fabric, reading the small tells in a person's hands that told her more than their mouths ever would, and she used every minute of that hour to work a second conversation beneath the first. "Your sons are striking," she said, midway through a clause about international distribution, her tone deliberately light. "Triplets must be a handful." "They keep me humble," Young-jun said, not looking up from the contract. "Are they yours by blood, or—" She let the question hang, casual as a stitch dropped on purpose. His pen stopped moving, just for a second. "They're mine," he said. "That's all that matters in my house." "Of course." She smiled, the kind of smile she'd perfected in 1,000 negotiations, warm enough to disarm and sharp enough to cut. "I only ask because Ji-ho, that's his name, isn't it, was quite taken with a detail on my dress last night. The embroidery. It's a technique I invented myself. Very few people in the world have ever even seen it before, let alone owned it." Young-jun set his pen down fully now and looked at her with the stillness of a man deciding how much a hand was worth showing. "Children notice strange things," he said. "It doesn't always mean what adults want it to mean." "Perhaps not," Cynthia said, "but I'd like to understand it anyway, as a mother would." The word landed exactly as she meant it to. Something flickered behind his eyes. Not guilt, she thought, but calculation. A man weighing what a stranger might already know against what he could still afford to hide. "The boys came to me under complicated circumstances," he said finally, choosing each word with the care of someone laying stones across a river. "Overseas. Some years ago. I don't discuss it, Ms. Okoro. Not with press, not with partners, and not, respectfully, at a contract signing." "I'm not press," she said quietly, "and I'm not asking as a partner." For a moment, neither of them said anything, the silence between them louder than the negotiation had been for the last hour. Then Young-jun closed the folder in front of him, a gesture of finality that told her the conversation, for today, was over. "The contract terms are acceptable," he said. "My legal team will send the finalized draft by Friday. Good day, Ms. Okoro." She left the building with a signed partnership and nothing else. No confirmation, no denial, only the unmistakable sense that she had touched something the man across the table would kill to keep buried. She didn't wait for Friday. Kemi found the name within a day, a private investigator in Itaewon who specialized in exactly the kind of quiet, expensive digging that never appeared in a police report. His name was Detective Park, retired from Seoul's fraud division, the sort of man who asked few questions about his clients, and even fewer about himself. Adoption records for the Lee triplets don't exist, Park told her 4 days later, sliding a folder across a table in the back of a nondescript noodle shop, the kind of place that existed specifically for conversations no one wanted overheard. Not officially. No hospital of origin. No documented birth certificates until they were nearly a year old. All 3 registered at once, in Geneva, under a private legal filing sealed by an NDA, thick enough to choke a courtroom. Cynthia's hands went still around her cup. Geneva. There's more. Park tapped a page. There was a broker operating out of Paris and Geneva around that time, a network moving newborns through falsified surrogacy contracts, mostly targeting women without the money or the standing to fight back. The operation collapsed suddenly, almost 8 years ago. No arrests, no trial, just gone. As if someone with considerable resources bought their way through it and shut the whole thing down overnight. Someone like Lee Young-jun, Cynthia said, and it wasn't a question. The timing lines up, Park said carefully. Whether he was the buyer or the reason it collapsed, that I can't tell you yet. The paper trail was scrubbed by people who know exactly what they're doing. But I'll tell you this much, Ms. Okoro. He closed the folder, his expression unreadable. Whoever did this wasn't hiding a crime for profit. Everything about the way it was buried says a man protecting something, not selling it. That distinction sat wrong in Cynthia's chest, all the way back to the hotel. The difference between a man who stole children and a man who took them somewhere no one could steal them again. She wanted him to be the villain. It would have been easier. Instead, she lay awake that night, with Park's folder spread across her bed, 3 photographs of 3 small faces she couldn't stop searching for pieces of herself in, and no clean answer at all. She didn't hear the knock at first. When it came again, sharper, she opened the door to find Lee Young-jun standing in the hallway alone, without security, without the armor of his office or his name. He looked, for the first time since she'd met him, tired. "You hired a man named Park," he said. "No greeting, no preamble. He's good. Most people wouldn't have found what he found in 4 days." Cynthia didn't bother denying it. "Then you know why. I know you think I bought 3 stolen children like merchandise." His voice wasn't angry, which somehow unsettled her more than fury would have. "I'd like the chance to tell you what actually happened, Miss Okoro. Not across a boardroom table, not through lawyers." He held her gaze, and for the first time she saw something raw underneath the composure. A man who had been carrying a truth alone for 7 years, and was, finally, exhausted by the weight of it. "Come to my estate tomorrow evening. Just you. I'll tell you everything, and then you can decide what kind of man I am." She should have said no. Every instinct she'd built her armor from told her to say no. "What time?" she asked instead. 7, he said, already turning to leave, and then, quieter, almost to himself. "You should know. I've spent 8 years terrified of this exact conversation. Not because I did something unforgivable." He paused at the elevator and looked back at her with an expression she wouldn't fully understand until much later. "Because I was afraid that if I ever found the boy's real mother, she'd never believe I did it to save them." The doors closed before she could answer, and Cynthia stood alone in the hallway a long time afterward, 3 small faces burning behind her eyes, and the terrible, hopeful suspicion beginning to take root that the man she'd come to Seoul to negotiate with might be the only person on earth who could finally give her children back to her. The Lee estate sat behind walls of dark stone and old pine, the kind of quiet that money bought when it wanted privacy instead of attention. Cynthia was led not to the main house but around it, through a covered walkway, to a private garden, where late afternoon light filtered gold through maple leaves, and koi moved lazily beneath a small wooden bridge. The triplets were already there, sitting cross-legged on a blanket spread across the grass, and when they saw her, all 3 went still in the same instant, the way only children who share a heartbeat seem to move. "You came," Ji-ho said, And it wasn't a question so much as relief, given a voice. I did. Cynthia lowered herself onto the blanket beside them, her ivory dress pooling in the grass, without her caring at all. Up close, they were breathtaking in the way only your own reflection can be. 3 identical faces, and yet she could already see the small differences. The way Jiho's brow furrowed like hers did when she was thinking hard. The way the boy beside him, Minho, tilted his head at exactly the angle she used when she was deciding whether to trust someone. Sun-ho, the quietest of the 3, simply stared at her the way people stare at something they've been told about their whole lives and are only now allowed to believe in. "We have something," Minho said, and nodded at his brothers, some silent permission passing between them. From beneath the blanket, Jiho drew out a small wooden box, worn soft at the corners from years of small hands opening it. Inside were 3 folded scraps of pale silk, edges frayed with age, each one stitched with the same spiraling pattern she had sewn into existence alone, in a cold apartment in Paris, the night before she lost everything. "Appa said we should never lose these," Sun-ho said quietly, the first full sentence she'd heard from him. "He said someone made them for us before we were even born, someone who loved us before she ever met us." Cynthia's hands trembled as she lifted one of the scraps, the stitches so familiar under her fingers it was like touching her own handwriting. "I did," she said, and her voice broke apart on the second word. "I made these. For you. All 3 of you." The boys looked at each other, and then at her, something enormous passing silently between 6 small eyes and one shattered, overjoyed adult heart. And then Jiho simply climbed into her lap, the way he must have wanted to at the gala, and put his head against her chest, and Cynthia wrapped her arms around a child she had carried and lost, and was only now, impossibly, allowed to hold. She didn't notice Youngjun standing at the edge of the garden until much later, watching the 4 of them with an expression he didn't try to hide. Not triumph, not vindication, just quiet, aching relief, as if a debt he'd carried for 7 years had finally, partially, come due. 3 days later, in a private clinic across the city, a Dr. Youngjun trusted personally handed Cynthia a sealed envelope with a steadiness that told her he already knew what was inside. Youngjun stood beside her, close enough that she could feel him holding his breath. She opened it with hands that didn't shake, because some part of her had already known since the garden, since the silk, since the first moment 3 boys had frozen in front of her in a ballroom. Probability of maternity, 99.9%. Youngjun exhaled like a man setting down something impossibly heavy. "I had to be certain," he said quietly, "before I let myself hope this was real, before I let them hope." "And now?" Cynthia asked, folding the paper against her chest. "Now," he said, "I owe you 7 years, and I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you never lose another day with them again." It should have ended there. Quiet, private, healed. But men like Director Han did not survive inside conglomerates like the Lee Group by allowing quiet endings. He came to Youngjun's office 2 weeks before the global launch, smiling the way men smile when they believe they hold the better hand. "An off-book adoption," he said, sliding a folder across the desk that contained photographs, DNA results, private clinic records, all of it, gathered by someone inside Youngjun's own security detail who had sold access for a price. "Buried European paperwork. A black market broker your father's company was rumored to have ties to, years before you took over. Do you understand what the press will do with this, Youngjun? Not just to you, to her." He nodded toward the closed door, beyond which Cynthia's brand meetings continued, unaware. A billionaire designer who abandoned her children for a surrogacy payout, conveniently discovering motherhood the moment it benefits her image. The story writes itself. I don't even need it to be true. I just need it to be loud. "You're threatening the mother of my sons." Young-jun said, very quietly. To protect your seat, on a board you were about to lose anyway. I'm protecting this company, Han said, from a scandal that will end it the moment it reaches a courtroom. Pull out of the collaboration, quietly. Pay her off if you must, or I release everything myself and let the world decide who the villain is. Young-jun didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at the man who had, he now understood with total clarity, been the reason the syndicate's collapse 8 years ago had never been properly investigated. A partial hand in burying a broker who might have led straight back to this office if anyone had looked closely enough. You should have destroyed the original records, Young-jun said, not just the ones in your files. Han's smile faltered for the first time. The night of the launch, Seoul's largest runway venue filled with the kind of crowd that existed to be seen seeing things first. Press from 4 continents, industry titans, the entire architecture of both empires, standing to gain or lose everything on a single show. Cynthia stood backstage in the final gown of her own collection. The silk pattern from the boys' blankets worked now into the collar, deliberate and unmistakable, a signature she no longer intended to hide. Han had made his move an hour before curtain, an anonymous leak to 3 outlets, fabricated documents painting Cynthia as complicit in a black market baby scheme designed to manufacture a redemption story for her brand. It was ugly and calculated and almost worked. Instead, Cynthia walked onto the runway herself before the first outfit even appeared, silencing the room the way only true stillness can. Young-jun stood at the edge of the stage and did not stop her. There's a story circulating tonight, she said, her voice carrying without a microphone needing to strain, about how I came to be a mother. I'd like to tell you the true one, since apparently several people have decided to tell a false one for me. She laid it out precisely, unflinchingly, the syndicate in Paris, the forced surrogacy contract, the 3 children taken from her before she'd even held them, the genetic results now displayed behind her on the screen, alongside authenticated silk trademark records, proving the pattern in her collection had existed, provably, 8 years before this collaboration was ever conceived. Beside those, Detective Park's investigation, the collapsed broker network, and finally, damningly, evidence tracing Director Han's fingerprints across the cover-up that had let the syndicate's true architects disappear untouched. Lee Young-jun didn't steal my sons, she said, and beside her Young-jun stepped forward at last, taking his place next to her without hesitation, in front of every camera in the room. He bought their freedom from men who would have sold 3 infants to 3 separate buyers, never to see each other again. He spent 7 years protecting them from a truth he was terrified would take them from him. He was their guardian, long before I ever had the chance to be their mother. I stand by every word she said, Young-jun told the room, his voice steady, final. And I am formally recognizing Cynthia Okoro as co-parent and birth mother of my sons, effective tonight, in front of all of you, so that no one, inside my company or outside it, ever attempts to use my children as a weapon again. By morning, Han had resigned under a board investigation he would not survive, and Cynthia Okoro's name was no longer merely trending for a fashion collaboration, but for a single photograph. 3 boys running across a stage into the arms of 2 people, finally standing together, in a shot in front of the world. Months later, the private garden at the Lee estate looked different, not grander, but lived in, scattered with small shoes by the back door, and a swing set installed at Sunho's insistence beneath the maple tree. Cynthia's new line launched that spring, under a single word stitched into every collar. The spiral pattern now had a name, printed on every tag. Triplets. A collection dedicated, publicly and unapologetically, to Min-ho, Ji-ho, and Sun-ho. She hadn't torn them from the only home they'd ever known, and Young-jun hadn't asked her to give up the empire she'd spent 8 years building instead of grieving. They had built something else instead. Two names on the same company letterhead. Two households merging into one extended, unusual, deeply loved family. Co-parenting across continents. And calendars with the same fierce precision they'd once brought to boardrooms. On the evening of the collection's launch party, Cynthia stood in the garden watching her sons chase each other across the grass in matching silk-lined jackets, and felt young June come to stand beside her, quiet, the way he always was in the moments that mattered most. 7 years, he said, watching the boys. I told myself I'd done the right thing, and never let myself believe I'd get to find out for certain. And now, Cynthia asked, echoing the question she'd asked him in that clinic hallway months before. He looked at her, and then at the 3 boys laughing beneath the maple tree, wearing a pattern she'd once stitched alone in grief, and now stitched everywhere in joy. Now, he said, I think we found exactly the right ending. And that's how a mother's silk thread found its way back to her. Through 7 years, 3 small hearts, and 1 impossible night in Seoul. If this story moved you, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. There's always another black silk story waiting to unfold. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I'd love to say hello. And if Cynthia and young June's reunion hit you right in the chest, tap that like button so more people can find this family the way you just did. See you in the next story.